The envelope was thin. Uncle Robert held it out without looking at him. "You're 18 now. We're done here." Marcus took it, didn't count it. Aunt Linda stood by the refrigerator, arms crossed, staring at the floor tiles like they held something important. She didn't say anything, didn't have to. 3 years in this house, 3 years of eating dinner at the corner of the table, of knocking before entering any room, of hearing his name spoken like a problem that needed solving. He picked up his duffel bag. Everything he owned fit inside. The door closed behind him. No one said goodbye. Marcus stood on the sidewalk, the October wind cutting through his jacket. He looked back once. The curtains didn't move. He started walking. If this opening stirred something quiet in you, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your hometown below. Sometimes the simplest hellos remind us we're not alone. The real estate office smelled like dust and old newspapers. A man in his 60s looked up from behind a cluttered desk, reading glasses sliding down his nose. His eyes moved from Marcus's face to the duffel bag, then back again. "The cabin," Marcus said. "The $5 one." The man leaned back in his chair. "You sure? Kid place been empty 15 years. Roof's shut. I ain't giving refunds." Marcus put the bill on the desk. The man shrugged, pulled out a single sheet of paper, a quitclaim deed. The words faded and smudged, and slid it across. "Sign here. County records will catch up eventually. It's yours." The walk took 30 minutes. The paved road turned to gravel, then dirt. Trees closed in on both sides, blocking out what little sun remained. No houses, no mailboxes, just the crunch of his shoes and the wind moving through bare branches. The cabin appeared through a gap in the trees. Marcus stopped. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine. 2 windows were shattered. The glass long gone. Weeds grew waist-high around the foundation, and the front door hung crooked on its hinges. Worse than he'd imagined. He pushed through the weeds. Inside, the smell hit first mold, rot, something animal. Cobwebs draped the corners. Mouse droppings scattered across the warped floorboards. A rusted wood stove sat against the far wall, its chimney pipe disconnected and hanging at an angle. In the back corner, more junk, a blackened cast-iron pan, collapsed shelving, broken glass. But there were walls. 4 of them, and a roof, even if it leaked. Marcus set his bag down in the corner farthest from the broken windows. The floor creaked under his weight as he lowered himself to sit. He pulled his knees to his chest. This was it. This was everything. A $5 cabin that nobody wanted. Bought by a boy nobody wanted either. His throat tightened, his eyes burned. He didn't fight it. The sound that came out of him was small, almost silent, something between a breath and a sob. Tears ran down his face and dripped onto his jeans, darkening the fabric in small circles. He didn't know how long he sat there. When the tears stopped, the light outside had shifted, colder now, darker, and somewhere in the walls, he heard a faint scratching sound. Something else was alive in here. The cold woke him. Marcus opened his eyes to gray light filtering through the broken windows. His breath came out in small white clouds. Every joint ached from sleeping on the hard floor. His jacket bunched under his head as a pillow. He sat up slowly, rubbing his hands together. The scratching sound from last night had stopped mice. Probably, living in the walls, he'd deal with them later. Right now, he needed heat. The wood stove sat against the wall like a forgotten promise. Cast iron, old but solid. The problem was the chimney pipe disconnected, clogged with years of debris. He could see bits of an old bird's nest poking out from the opening. Marcus stood, his knees popping. He walked the perimeter of the cabin, really looking this time. In the corner near what used to be a kitchen, he found a wooden crate, half hidden under collapsed shelving. Inside, a hammer with a cracked handle, a handsaw with rust spots but still sharp teeth, a coffee can full of bent nails, and a pair of work gloves stiff with age. Someone had left these behind 15 years ago, maybe longer. He pulled on the gloves. They cracked at the seams but held together. First, the chimney. He dragged a wooden chair beneath the pipe and climbed up. The chair wobbled. He steadied himself against the wall, reached into the opening, and pulled. A clump of twigs and dried leaves came loose, showering his face with dust and debris. He coughed, eyes watering, and kept pulling. The work was slower than he'd expected. Each handful of debris revealed more behind it, compacted leaves. Mud dauber nests, something that might have been a dead bird years ago. His arms burned from reaching overhead. His fingers, even through the gloves, were raw from gripping the rough metal edges. Twice he lost his balance and had to grab the wall to keep from falling. 3 times he had to climb down, rest, and start again. By late afternoon, he could finally see daylight through the top. The walk to town felt longer in the fading light. Marcus counted his remaining money twice, $43 and change. It had to last. The hardware store sat on Main Street between a closed-down barber shop and a laundromat. A bell chimed when he pushed open the door. The man behind the counter, bald, maybe 70, reading a newspaper, glanced up and went back to reading. Marcus moved through the aisles. Wire, industrial tape, a roll of heavy plastic sheeting. He added 2 cans of beans, a can of soup, and a box of matches. At the counter, the man rang up each item without comment. "That'll be $12.40. Marcus handed over the bills. The man counted back his change, slid the bag across the counter, and returned to his newspaper. "No, where are you staying? No, you okay? Kid, just a transaction." Marcus picked up the bag and left. Back at the cabin, he worked until his hands shook. He reconnected the chimney pipe, wrapping the joints with wire and sealing them with tape. The pipe wasn't straight. It angled slightly where the metal had warped, but it held. He tested the draft by lighting a match and holding it near the stove's opening. The flame bent inward, pulled by the airflow. Good enough. He gathered wood next, dead branches from the trees behind the cabin, snapping them into pieces small enough to fit. Rotten planks from the collapsed shed he had spotted earlier, dry enough to burn. His palms blistered through the worn gloves. One blister popped, and he hissed at the sting. Wiping the fluid on his jeans, the first fire took 3 tries. The kindling caught, then smoked, then died. He crumpled newspaper pages tighter, arranged the twigs differently, and tried again. More smoke. The cabin filled with a gray haze that made his eyes water. On the 3rd try, the flame held, small at first, flickering orange against the blackened interior of the stove. Marcus fed it carefully a twig, then another, then a larger branch. The wood crackled. Heat began to radiate from the iron. He sat back on the floor, watching. The fire grew, shadows danced on the walls. The cabin, for the first time, felt like something other than a ruin. He held his hands toward the warmth. The blisters stung. His shoulders ached from hours of reaching and pulling. His stomach growled he hadn't eaten since yesterday. But the fire burned. He had made that happen. These hands, his hands, had cleared a chimney and sealed a pipe, and coaxed flame from cold wood. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But it was something. He ate cold beans from the can, too tired to heat them. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim red glow across the floor, outside. The wind had picked up, rattling the plastic sheeting he'd taped over one of the broken windows. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter and lay down near the stove. The warmth was fading already. He'd need more wood tomorrow, better wood dry, seasoned, not the half-rotten branches he'd gathered today. And he'd need to fix that window properly, and patch the roof, and figure out what to do about the mice, and find a way to make $30 stretch until what? He stared at the ceiling, where water stains spread like old bruises. What was he doing here, fixing a cabin nobody wanted? Living in a place nobody knew about? Working himself raw for what to survive another week, another month, and then? His mother used to hold his hand when they walked. He remembered that, suddenly. The memory sharp and unwelcome, her fingers wrapped around his. Warm and certain, like she'd never let go. But she had. Everyone did. His eyes burned, but no tears came this time. He was too tired for tears, too tired for anything except lying here, watching the last ember pulse red in the darkness. Tomorrow he would wake up cold again. Tomorrow he would work again, and none of it mattered to anyone but him. Outside, the wind shifted. The temperature was dropping through the gaps in the walls. He could feel it, winter breathing closer, patient and inevitable. He had maybe 3 weeks before the real cold came. 3 weeks to make this place livable, and he wasn't sure he had 3 weeks left in him. The rain started on the 4th day. Marcus woke to the sound of it hammering the roof, a relentless drumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He sat up quickly, heart pounding, and looked at the ceiling. Water dripped through in 3 places. 2 of them he'd patched. The plastic sheeting had pulled loose overnight, and now brown-tinged water fell in steady streams, pooling on the warped floorboards. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed the empty bean cans from the corner, and positioned them under the leaks. The ping-ping-ping of water hitting metal joined the roar of rain outside. The fire had gone out. He knelt by the stove and tried to restart it. His hands shook from cold, from hunger, from something else he didn't want to name. The matches were damp. The first 3 broke against the striker. The 4th caught, but the kindling wouldn't take. Too wet. Everything was too wet. Marcus sat back on his heels and stared at the dead stove. The rain didn't stop. Day 2, day 3. The sky stayed the color of slate, heavy and unbroken. Water found new paths through the roof, dripping in places he hadn't noticed before. The cabin smelled of mold and rot, the damp seeping into everything: his clothes, his sleeping spot, the walls themselves. He ate the last can of soup cold on the 2nd day. The beans were gone. His money was gone. On the 3rd morning, he walked to the doorway and looked out at the gray curtain of rain. The path to town had turned to mud. Even if he walked there, what would he do? He had nothing left to spend. He went back inside and lay down on the floor. The ceiling above him was stained in patterns that looked like maps of places that didn't exist. He traced them with his eyes. Here was a coastline. There, a mountain range. Somewhere in the brown and yellow blotches, a country where people built houses that didn't leak, where 18-year-olds weren't thrown out like broken furniture. His stomach cramped. He curled onto his side and waited for it to pass. The 4th day. The rain eased to a steady drizzle. Marcus hadn't moved in hours. maybe longer. Time had become strange, elastic, and meaningless. He knew he should get up, check the roof, try to find dry wood, do something. He didn't move. The cans under the leaks had overflowed. Water spread across the floor in thin, creeping sheets. He watched it reach the edge of his sleeping spot, darken the fabric of his jacket, and keep moving. He should care about that. He didn't. What was the point? He'd fixed the chimney, sealed the pipes, cleared the weeds, patched the windows, worked until his hands bled and his muscles screamed. And here he was, lying in a puddle, starving, alone. Nobody knew he was here if he walked into the forest and didn't come back. How long before anyone noticed? A week, a month, never. The old man at the real estate office wouldn't wonder. The hardware store clerk wouldn't ask. Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda certainly wouldn't care. They'd probably be relieved that the problem had solved itself. Marcus closed his eyes. His mother's face surfaced in the darkness behind his eyelids. Not the sick version. Not the one at the end. The earlier one. Laughing at something he'd said. Her hand warm on his cheek. That version had been gone for 3 years now. Sometimes it felt like she'd taken everything good with her when she left. He didn't know when he'd gotten up, but he found himself sitting on the cabin's front step, the drizzle misting his face and hair. The forest stretched out before him, gray and endless. The trees stood like witnesses, silent and indifferent. Between them, shadows pooled in the underbrush, dark enough to disappear into. He could walk out there, just stand up and walk. Keep walking until the cabin was gone, until the town was gone, until everything was gone. It wouldn't even be a decision. Really, just an absence of decisions, a stopping. His hands rested on his knees. They were thin. When had they gotten so thin? The blisters had scabbed over, and new calluses had formed beneath them. Working hands, hands that had built and fixed and tried. For what? The question sat in his chest like a stone. He'd spent his whole life being someone's problem. His mother's problem when she got sick and couldn't work. His uncle's problem when she died and someone had to take him in. Now he was his own problem. And he didn't have the energy left to solve himself. The drizzle thickened. Drops ran down his face, into his collar, soaking through what was left of his dry clothes. He should go inside. He didn't move. The forest waited. How long he sat there, he couldn't say. The light shifted. The drizzle slowed, then stopped. The clouds remained, low and heavy. But the rain had finally exhausted itself. Marcus stared at nothing. His body felt distant, like something that belonged to someone else. The cold had seeped in so deep that his shivering had slowed to occasional tremors. That probably meant something. He couldn't remember what. A bird called somewhere in the trees. Then silence. He should go inside, light a fire, find food somehow. Keep going. The words moved through his mind like objects floating past in a river. He watched them go, and then a sound. Not rain, not wind, not an animal moving through underbrush. Footsteps. Marcus's head lifted slowly. The sound grew closer, steady, purposeful. Someone walking through wet leaves, through mud, through the forest that shouldn't have anyone in it. He squinted into the gray distance between the trees. A shape emerged. A figure. Moving toward the cabin, human. Walking with the uneven gait of exhaustion. Shoulders hunched against the damp. Marcus didn't move. Didn't call out. Didn't run. He just watched. The figure came closer. Took form. A woman, older 50, maybe 60. Gray hair plastered to her face, clothes soaked through, clinging to a frame that looked too thin. She walked like someone who had been walking for a very long time, and on her face, even from this distance, Marcus could see it, a bruise, dark against her cheekbone, spreading toward her eye, days old, maybe a week, the kind of bruise that didn't come from falling. She stopped at the edge of the clearing. Their eyes met. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, cracked and hoarse, like she hadn't used it in days. "I'm sorry," she said. Could I just get out of the rain just for a bit?" The woman stood at the edge of the clearing, swaying slightly on her feet. Marcus didn't answer right away. His mind moved slowly, like gears grinding through rust. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the trees, from the eaves, from everything. She took a small step forward, then stopped, waiting. The bruise on her cheek was purple at the center, yellowing at the edges, a week old, maybe more. Her clothes a thin jacket over a floral blouse. Dark pants soaked to the knees hung loose on her frame. She clutched a small canvas bag against her chest, like it contained everything she owned. Maybe it did. "Please," she said. Her voice cracked on the word. "I saw the smoke from the ridge. I've been walking since—" She didn't finish. Her legs buckled slightly, and she caught herself, pressing one hand against the nearest tree. Marcus watched her. Every instinct he'd built over 3 years of being unwanted told him to say no. Don't let anyone in. Don't get attached. Don't give anyone the chance to leave. But she wasn't asking to stay. She was asking to get out of the rain, and the rain had already stopped. He looked at her face again, at the bruise, at the way she held herself, shoulders curved inward, making herself smaller, at the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of nights without sleep. He knew that posture. He'd seen it in the mirror. Marcus stood up slowly. His legs protested stiff from sitting too long in the cold. He stepped to the side, leaving the doorway open. He didn't say, "Come in." Didn't say anything, just moved. The woman hesitated. Her eyes flicked from his face to the dark interior of the cabin, then back. Something shifted in her expression, not relief exactly, but the absence of one particular fear. She walked forward, her steps unsteady on the muddy ground. Inside, Marcus knelt by the wood stove and tried to restart the fire. The woman lowered herself onto the floor near the opposite wall, as far from him as the small space allowed. She set her bag in her lap and wrapped her arms around it, still shivering. The kindling was damp but not soaked. Marcus arranged it carefully, the way he'd learned through trial and error. Small pieces first, space for air. He struck a match dry this time, from the middle of the box, and held it to the base. The flame caught, held, grew. He fed it slowly, adding twigs, then larger sticks. The fire crackled and popped, casting orange light across the warped floorboards. Neither of them spoke. Marcus sat back against the wall on his side of the cabin. The woman stayed on hers. The fire burned between them. The only sound except for the occasional drip of water from the ceiling into the coals he'd positioned. He studied her without being obvious about it. 55, maybe 60. Gray hair that might have been styled once, now tangled and wet. Hands that trembled as she held them toward the growing warmth. A wedding ring on her left hand, plain gold. Worn thin, the bruise. He'd seen bruises like that before, on a woman at the grocery store when he was 12, on a neighbor who always wore long sleeves, even in summer. His mother had explained it to him once, her voice careful and sad. Some people hurt the ones they should protect. He didn't ask about it. Some things you didn't ask about. You just knew. The fire had burned down to coals when the woman finally spoke. "Thank you." Her voice was stronger now, though still rough. She kept her eyes on the embers, not looking at him. Marcus nodded, said nothing. "I won't be trouble," she continued. "Soon as I can walk proper again, I'll go." He didn't tell her she could stay, didn't tell her she had to leave. He just let the words sit in the air between them. The silence stretched. Outside, the clouds were breaking apart. Thin light filtered through the gaps, turning the wet forest silver and gray. The temperature would drop tonight. Marcus could feel it already, that particular stillness in the air that came before serious cold. The woman shivered again. Though she was closer to the fire now, her clothes were still damp. She had no blanket, no dry layers, nothing but that small bag. Marcus looked at his own jacket, bunched in the corner where he slept. It was his only warm layer, his only pillow. He didn't move toward it, but he didn't look away either. Night came slowly. Marcus added more wood to the fire, building it higher than usual. The cabin warmed, not comfortable, but bearable. The woman had stopped shivering. She sat with her back against the wall, her bag still clutched in her lap, her eyes half closed. He lay down in his corner, using his arm as a pillow instead of his jacket. Sleep didn't come. He listened to the sounds of the cabin, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through the gaps in the walls, the steady breathing of another person, another person. How long since he'd shared space with anyone? Weeks longer. He'd forgotten how loud silence could be when someone else was in it. The woman shifted. Marcus kept his eyes closed, but he could hear her moving, the rustle of fabric, the creak of the floorboard, then stillness again. He cracked one eye open. She was lying down now, curled on her side with her back to him. Her shoulders rose and fell in the rhythm of someone pretending to sleep. Same as him. Two strangers in a broken cabin, both pretending to be asleep, both listening to the other breathe. Marcus closed his eye. The fire crackled. Outside, something moved in the underbrush, an animal. Probably hunting in the post-rain darkness. He focused on his own breathing. In, out, in, out. The woman's breathing gradually slowed, evened out. Real sleep this time, not pretend. Marcus lay still and stared at the ceiling, for the first time in weeks. He wasn't alone. He didn't know how to feel about that. Part of him wanted her gone by morning, wanted his solitude back, his familiar emptiness, the safety of having nothing to lose. Another part, smaller, quieter, noticed that the cabin felt different with someone else in it. Not warmer exactly, not safer, just less empty, less like a grave. He pushed the thought away and closed his eyes. Tomorrow she would leave. Everything would go back to normal. That's what he told himself. But in the moment, before sleep finally took him, he heard her murmur something in her dreams, a name, maybe, or a word he couldn't make out. And then, barely audible, "Please, not again." Marcus's eyes opened in the darkness. The fire had burned low. The woman's shoulders trembled, and somewhere far down the dirt road, so faint he might have imagined it, he heard the sound of an engine. The smell woke him. Marcus opened his eyes and lay still, confused. Something warm, something food. He sat up slowly. The woman knelt by the wood stove, stirring a small pot. Steam rose from it, carrying a scent he hadn't smelled in weeks. She'd found his remaining supplies, the oatmeal he'd forgotten in the bottom of his bag, mixed with water and heated over the rebuilt fire. She looked up at the sound of his movement. Figured you could use something warm, she said. Her voice was steadier than yesterday. Stronger. Hope you don't mind. Marcus didn't answer. He watched her ladle the thin porridge into his only cup and hold it out toward him. He took it. The oatmeal was watery, barely flavored, but hot. He drank it in slow sips, feeling the warmth spread through his chest and stomach. When was the last time someone had made him food? He couldn't remember. Before his mother got sick. Maybe. Years ago. The woman ate from the pot with a bent spoon she must have found somewhere. They didn't speak. Didn't need to. When they finished, she took the cup and pot to the corner where water pooled from last night's dripping and rinsed them with handfuls of cold rainwater. Marcus watched her work. She hadn't left. She'd said she would, but she hadn't. He didn't ask why. 10 days passed. Marcus patched the roof leak with tar paper and plastic sheeting, climbing up on a makeshift ladder he'd built from scrap wood. Below, the woman, he still didn't know her name, hadn't asked, gathered the scattered debris from the cabin floor and piled it outside for burning. He fixed the second window, cutting a piece of plywood to fit the frame. She found rags in the corner and wiped down the walls, clearing away years of cobwebs and dust. He chopped wood. She stacked it by the stove. He repaired the broken step at the front door. She swept the porch clean. They didn't talk much. A few words here and there. Hand me that. Watch your step. Getting colder, but nothing more. Nothing personal. And yet, something shifted. Marcus noticed it first in the mornings. He'd wake to find the fire already burning. The woman crouched beside it, coaxing the flames higher. She'd nod at him, and he'd nod back, and they'd move through the routine they'd somehow built without planning it. Then the evenings, they'd sit on opposite sides of the cabin, the fire between them, the silence no longer awkward. Just quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. He started expecting her to be there. That scared him more than the cold. On the 11th day, they walked to town together. Marcus hadn't planned it. He'd mentioned needing supplies. They were running low on everything, and she'd stood up and pulled on her jacket. "I'll come with," she said, not a question. He didn't argue. The walk took 40 minutes. The mud had dried to hard ruts in the road, and the morning air bit at their exposed skin. The woman walked slowly, her stamina still recovering from whatever journey had brought her here. But she didn't complain, didn't ask him to slow down, just kept moving. The town looked different with someone beside him. Smaller, somehow, less hostile. The general store sat on the corner of Main Street. Marcus pushed open the door, the bell chiming overhead, and headed for the canned goods aisle. The woman followed a few steps behind. He was reaching for a can of beans when he heard it. A voice, low, surprised. "Margaret." Marcus turned. A woman behind the counter, middle-aged, heavy-set, wearing a faded apron, was staring at his companion. Her eyes moved from the gray hair to the fading bruise, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, understanding, pity. The woman beside Marcus Margaret went rigid. "Doris," she said quietly. The clerk's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at Marcus, then back at Margaret, then down at the counter. I didn't know you were. I thought you were still in—" "I left." Margaret's voice was flat. Final, silence. The clerk nodded slowly, her expression careful now, guarded. "Well, good to see you look—" She trailed off, unable to find words that fit. Margaret picked up a box of matches from the shelf beside her. We should go. Marcus paid for their supplies. The clerk rang them up without speaking, her eyes darting to Margaret every few seconds. When she handed back the change, her fingers lingered. You be careful now, she said softly. To Margaret, not to Marcus. You hear? Margaret didn't answer. They walked out into the cold morning, and neither of them mentioned what had happened, but Marcus noticed how Margaret kept glancing over her shoulder the whole way back. Word travels fast in small towns. He knew that much, and whatever Margaret was running from, it had a name now, a history, people who knew. That night, she talked. They sat by the fire, the cabin warm for once, the repaired roof holding against a light wind that had picked up after sunset. Margaret stared into the flames, her hands wrapped around a cup of weak tea made from leaves she'd found in his supplies. I used to have a garden, she said. Marcus looked up. Tomatoes big as your fist. Cucumbers, peppers. Lord knows I missed that garden. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. 30 years I worked that soil, knew every inch of it. He didn't ask what happened to it. Didn't need to. Folks think it's the big things you miss, she continued. The house, the furniture, She stopped, swallowed. But it ain't that. It's the little things. The way the dirt smelled after rain. The sound of birds in the morning. Having something to tend. Marcus watched the firelight play across her face. Something that needed you, she said quietly. I reckon that's what I miss most. The words hung in the air. Marcus thought about the cabin, the leaks he'd patched, the windows he'd fixed, the fire he'd learned to build. Something that needed you. He understood that. Later, lying in his corner with his jacket bunched under his head, Marcus stared at the ceiling and listened to Margaret's breathing slow into sleep. Tomorrow he would wake up, and she would be here. The fire would be burning. There would be something warm to eat, someone to hand tools to work beside, to share silence with. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he wasn't dreading the morning. He wasn't hoping for it either, not yet. That felt too dangerous, too much like wanting something he could lose. But the weight in his chest had shifted, lightened. Maybe, just a little. He closed his eyes. Sleep came easier than it had in weeks. He woke once in the night. Not from cold, not from sound. Just woke. The fire had burned low, casting dim red light across the floor. Margaret's side of the cabin was empty. Marcus sat up, his heart suddenly pounding. Then he saw her. She stood at the window, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She'd pulled aside the plastic sheeting and was peering out into the darkness, her face pale in the moonlight. Her hands were trembling. Marcus watched her lips move. No sound came out, but he could read the shape of the words. Please, not yet. Give me a little more time. She was staring down the dirt road toward town, watching for headlights that hadn't come. Yet, the fire had burned low when Margaret spoke again. Not about gardens this time. Not about tomatoes or cucumbers or the things she missed. Something else. Something heavier. She sat with her back against the wall, her face half in shadow. The flames cast moving patterns across the floor between them. Outside. The wind had picked up, pushing against the plastic-covered windows with soft, irregular thuds. I was 19 when I married him, she said. Marcus didn't move, didn't speak. Frank. She said the name like it tasted bitter. He was 23, handsome, had a job at the mill. Everyone said I was lucky. A sound came from her throat, not quite a laugh. Lucky. She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller. The gesture was familiar. Marcus had seen her do it before, whenever the wind blew too hard or the sound came from outside. First time he hit me. We'd been married 2 years. I burned dinner. Pork chops. Cooked them too long and they dried out. She stared at the embers. He backhanded me so hard I fell into the stove. Burned my arm. Told the doctor I'd tripped. Marcus's hands tightened on his knees. I thought it was my fault. She continued. Thought if I cooked better, cleaned better, was better it would stop. The fire crackled. A log shifted, sending up a small shower of sparks. It didn't stop. She told him things then, things Marcus wished he could unhear. The closed fists that came after the open hands, the kicks when she was already down, the nights spent locked in the cellar for talking back, the broken ribs she never got treated because how would she explain the way she learned to read his moods, to make herself invisible, to become so small she almost disappeared? 30 years of that. Folks knew, she said. Her voice had gone flat, drained of inflection. Course they knew. Small town like that, everyone knows everything. But nobody said nothing. Not my neighbors, not my own sister. She swallowed hard. I tried the sheriff once, just once. He was Frank's hunting buddy, told me to go home and stop making trouble, said a man's got a right to discipline his wife. Marcus thought about the clerk at the general store, the way she'd looked at Margaret, the careful, guarded expression. I stopped going to church after a while, Margaret continued. Couldn't stand the way they'd look at me, like I was something broken, something shameful, like I'd brought it on myself. She looked down at her hands. Maybe I did. That's the truth of it. Maybe I deserved... No. The word came out before Marcus could stop it. Margaret looked up, startled. Nobody deserves that, he said. His voice was quiet but steady. Nobody. She stared at him for a long moment. Then her face crumpled. You don't understand. Her voice broke. I stayed. 30 years. I stayed. What kind of woman stays? What kind of fool? She couldn't finish. Her shoulders shook. She pressed her hands against her face. But the sounds escaped anyway, raw. Jagged sounds that seemed torn from somewhere deep. I crawled, she whispered through her fingers. The night I left, he'd knocked me down in the yard, and I crawled through the mud to get to the road. On my hands and knees, like an animal, mud in my mouth, mud in my hair, and I kept thinking, this is what I am now. This is all I am. Dirt. Marcus watched her curl forward, her face pressing against her knees. Her shoulders shook. No sound came out. She'd learned to cry silently. He realized, learned not to make noise, learned not to take up space even in her own grief. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if there was anything to say, so he didn't. He just sat there, on his side of the fire, and let her cry. When she finally looked up, her face was wet and blotchy. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing tears across her cheeks. I'm sorry, she said. Lord, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. You don't need to hear all that. I'm talking too much. I always talk too much. Frank used to say, you don't need to apologize. The words came out quiet, simple. Margaret froze. Marcus met her eyes across the fire. You don't, he said again. Something broke in her face then. Not grief, something else. Something deeper. Her mouth trembled. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. but she didn't look away. "You're the first person," she whispered. "The first one who ever—" She couldn't finish. Marcus looked at the floor, the warped boards, the gaps between them. He thought about Uncle Robert saying, "We're done here," about Aunt Linda staring at the floor, about it 18 years of being someone's problem. "I know what it's like," he said. "Being told you're too much, taking up too much space." Margaret wiped her face again. Her hands had stopped shaking. "You know," she said after a long moment, "I didn't think I'd find anywhere when I left. Nobody takes in people like me." People like me. Marcus understood that phrase. He was people like that too. They sat in silence as the fire burned lower. Margaret's breathing evened out. She leaned her head against the wall, her eyes half closed. The tension had drained from her body, not all of it, but some. Enough. Marcus watched her without watching. The way she held her hands loose in her lap now instead of clutched tight. The way her shoulders had dropped from their defensive hunch. She trusted him. The realization sat strange in his chest, heavy but not unpleasant. Someone trusted him. Someone had told him the worst thing about themselves, and he hadn't turned away. "Get some sleep," Marcus said. She nodded, not moving. "Marcus, yeah. Thank you." Her voice was barely audible. "For listening. For not—" She stopped, took a breath. "Just thank you." He didn't answer. Didn't need to. The fire crackled. The wind pushed against the walls. Word travels fast in small towns. Marcus knew that. Doris at the store had recognized Margaret, had seen the bruise, had known exactly what it meant. And in a place like this, news moved from mouth to mouth, like water finding cracks. It was only a matter of time. Marcus woke to darkness. The fire had burned to ash. The cabin was cold. Something had pulled him from sleep, a sound, a feeling. He wasn't sure. He lay still, listening. Wind, the creak of old wood, Margaret's breathing from across the room, and then distant, but unmistakable, an engine. Growing louder, Marcus sat up slowly. His heart began to pound. Headlights cut through the gaps in the cabin walls, sweeping across the trees outside. The engine noise grew, then stopped. A door slammed. Margaret was already awake, already sitting up. Her face had gone white, the color draining so fast he could see it happen even in the darkness. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no." Her hands were shaking again, and from somewhere down the dirt road, somewhere in the darkness between here and the cabin, Marcus heard a voice, male, loud, calling a name, "Margaret." The footsteps came closer. Marcus stood frozen by the cold stove, listening. Heavy boots on wet ground, branches snapping, a flashlight beam cutting through the trees, visible now through gaps in the cabin walls. "Margaret, I know you're here." The voice was thick with rage. Male, getting louder. Margaret had backed into the corner, her whole body trembling. Her hands pressed flat against the wall behind her. Fingers splayed like she was trying to push through the wood itself. "I have to go," she whispered. If I just go with him, he won't hurt you. You're young. You don't need to. Stay there." Marcus didn't recognize his own voice. It came out low and flat. A stranger's voice. He moved toward the door. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hands shook. Every instinct screamed at him to hide, to stay quiet, to let this pass like he'd let everything else pass. He was 18 years old and weighed maybe 140 pounds. He'd never been in a fight, never stood up to anyone, but Margaret was in the corner, and he knew in his bones what waited for her if she walked out that door. He'd spent his whole life watching people turn away. Uncle Robert turning away, Aunt Linda turning away, Margaret's sister driving her back, the sheriff telling her to stop making trouble, the whole town pretending not to see. Everyone always turned away. His hand found the door handle. The man outside was big. That was Marcus's first thought when he pushed the door open and stepped onto the porch. The flashlight beam swung toward him, blinding, and behind it stood a shape that blocked out the trees. Wide shoulders, thick arms, a face red with anger and something else drink. Maybe, or just 30 years of getting whatever he wanted. Frank. He was maybe 55, with a gut that strained his flannel shirt and hands like slabs of meat. His boots were caked with mud from the walk up the road. His breath came in clouds in the cold air. Who the... He squinted past the flashlight glare. The kid from the cabin. You the one been hiding her. Marcus stepped forward. The porch step creaked under his weight. The cold cut through his thin jacket. But he didn't feel it. Didn't feel anything except the drumbeat of his own pulse. She's not going with you. Frank laughed. A single bark, humorless. Boy, you don't know anything about what she wants. That's my wife in there. 30 years of marriage, and she thinks she can just walk out. She doesn't want to go. I don't care what she wants. Frank moved closer. He was a head taller than Marcus. Maybe more. Get out of my way. Marcus didn't move. He should have. Every logical part of his brain told him to. This man could break him in half, could put him in the hospital or in the ground, and no one would ever know or care. He was an 18-year-old with nothing, no family, no money, no future. What was he going to do? What could he possibly do? But Margaret was inside, and she'd made him oatmeal. She'd listened to him say nothing, just to fill the silence. She'd swept the floor and stacked the wood and been there every morning when he woke up. She'd looked at him like he mattered. No one had looked at him like that since his mother died. This is my place, Marcus said. His voice shook. He couldn't stop it. And she doesn't want to go. Frank's eyes narrowed. The flashlight beam wavered as his hand tightened around it. You got some nerve, boy. You know what I could do to you? Marcus knew. He knew exactly. Yeah, he said. But she's still not going. For a long moment, nothing happened. Frank stood on the muddy ground, flashlight in one hand, the other clenched into a fist at his side. Marcus stood on the porch, shaking, his hands balled at his sides, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. The wind blew between them, cold and sharp. Marcus waited for the hit, waited for Frank to charge up the steps and slam him into the wall, waited for the pain he knew was coming. Frank took a step forward, then stopped. Something shifted in his face. The rage was still there. Marcus could see it pulsing in the vein at his temple, in the way his fist kept tightening and releasing. But something else moved behind his eyes, a calculation. This wasn't his house. This wasn't his town. This wasn't his land where no one would see, where no one would hear, where he could do whatever he wanted and call it discipline. This was somewhere else, somewhere unfamiliar, with a witness. Frank's eyes flicked to the cabin window, to where Margaret's face was visible in the darkness, pale and tear-streaked, watching. For 30 years, she'd done what he wanted. For 30 years, she'd come back, and now here she was, standing in a stranger's cabin, being defended by a kid who had nothing except the willingness to stand. Frank's mouth twisted, his fist unclenched, clenched again. "This ain't over," he said. The words were hard, but something had gone out of his voice. Some edge had dulled. He wasn't used to this, wasn't used to people who didn't step aside. He spat on the ground at the base of the porch steps, turned, walked back toward the darkness where his truck waited. Marcus didn't move. He listened to the footsteps retreat, listened to the truck door slam, listened to the engine start, rev, and pull away. The sound fading until there was nothing left but wind and silence. His legs gave out. He sat down hard on the porch step, his whole body shaking. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. His breath came in short, ragged gasps that hurt his chest. The door opened behind him. Margaret stepped out. She moved slowly, like someone walking through water. She lowered herself onto the step beside him. Neither of them spoke. The cold pressed in. The stars were out now, sharp points of light through breaks in the clouds. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. "You didn't have to do that," Margaret said finally. Her voice was barely a whisper. "He could have, I know." "Why?" Marcus stared at his shaking hands, at the calluses and the scabbed-over blisters. Working hands, hands that had built and fixed and tried. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "That first morning, you could have left. Probably should have." Margaret was quiet. "But you stayed. You made breakfast. You—" He stopped, swallowed. "You stayed." The wind blew. Margaret reached out and put her hand over his. Her fingers were cold, thin, lined with age and work and years of things she'd never talk about again, but steady now, not shaking. "Thank you," she said. Marcus nodded. His throat was too tight to speak. They sat there together on the porch step. Two people who had nothing, looking out at the dark forest and the cold stars. And for the first time in his life, Marcus understood what it meant to be needed, not used, not tolerated, not a problem to be solved, needed. The fire inside the cabin had gone out completely. The warmth had faded, but neither of them moved to go in. Margaret squeezed his hand once, then let go. "We should go inside," she said. "It's cold." Marcus nodded. He stood, held out his hand. She took it, and as he helped her up, he heard himself ask the question he'd been afraid to voice, the one that had been building since the first morning she'd stayed. "Margaret." "Yes." "What happens now?" The days after Frank left were quiet. Marcus woke each morning to the sound of the fire crackling, to the smell of whatever Margaret had managed to make from their dwindling supplies. Coffee, mostly weak and bitter, stretched thin with too much water. Sometimes oatmeal, once biscuits she'd baked in the cast-iron pan, golden and warm. They didn't talk about that night, didn't need to. The cabin felt different now. The same warped floorboards, the same patched roof, the same plastic-covered windows. But something had shifted in the air between the walls. Something Marcus couldn't name, but could feel every time he walked through the door. He repaired the front step properly, replacing the rotted wood with planks he'd salvaged from a collapsed shed deeper in the forest. Margaret held the boards steady while he hammered, her hands sure and patient. "Little to the left," she said. He adjusted, hammered again. "That's it." They worked in comfortable silence, the rhythm of labor filling the spaces where words might have gone. Hammer, hold, adjust, hammer. When the step was done, Margaret sat down on it and ran her hand across the smooth surface. "Not bad," she said. "Not bad at all." Marcus sat beside her. The November Chopin was weak but present. cutting through the bare branches to warm their faces. The first real sunshine in weeks. "You know," Margaret said, "this old place ain't half bad anymore." Marcus looked at the cabin, at the roof that no longer leaked, at the windows that held their plastic tight against the wind, at the woodpile stacked neat against the side wall, enough to last a month if they were careful. He'd built that, fixed that, made it work, not alone, but still. That evening, they sat by the fire. The routine had become familiar. Dinner canned stew tonight, heated slowly over the flames, eaten in the warmth of the stove. The dishes rinsed with water, Margaret heated in the pot. The fire stoked for the night, logs positioned to burn slow and steady until morning. Margaret had found a comb somewhere in her bag, and she pulled it through her gray hair, working out tangles. The firelight softened the lines of her face, made the fading bruise almost invisible. Marcus watched her from his side of the cabin. She'd been here almost 3 weeks now. 3 weeks of mornings and evenings. 3 weeks of meals shared and work done and silence that didn't need filling. He'd stopped expecting her to leave. That scared him, still scared him, but less than before. "Margaret." She looked up, the comb pausing mid-stroke. His throat tightened. The words he wanted to say caught somewhere below his tongue, tangled in all the reasons he shouldn't say them. What if she said no? What if she laughed? What if this was just temporary for her? Just a place to rest until something better came along. But he'd stood on a porch and faced down a man twice his size. Surely he could do this. "You." He stopped, swallowed, started again. "You want to stay, stay for real, not just—" He couldn't finish. His face burned. He looked at the fire instead of her. Silence. It stretched long enough that Marcus started to regret speaking. Started to compose the backtrack. The "never mind." The "forget I said anything," that would let them both pretend this moment hadn't happened. Then Margaret set down the comb. "You asking me to live here?" Her voice was careful, neutral, giving nothing away. "I'm asking if you want to." He still couldn't look at her. "If you'd rather go somewhere else. I understand. This place isn't much. I can't offer." "Marcus." He stopped. "Look at me." He did. Margaret's eyes were bright in the firelight. Wet. Maybe. But her face was calm, steady. The corners of her mouth curved upward. Not a full smile. Not yet. But the beginning of one. "I'd like that," she said. The words hung in the air. "I'd like to stay." Marcus didn't sleep much that night. He lay in his corner, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin, the pop of the fire, the creak of settling wood, the whisper of wind through the gaps he hadn't patched yet. Margaret's breathing, slow and even. From her side of the room, she was staying. The thought kept circling back, each time feeling more real and less like something he'd imagined. She was staying. She wanted to stay. Someone wanted to be here with him, in this broken-down cabin in the middle of nowhere. He thought about Uncle Robert's face when he'd handed over the envelope. The flat eyes, the turned back. "We're done here." He thought about his mother's hand in his, warm and certain. The last time anyone had chosen him. Until now. Morning came gray and cold. Marcus woke to find Margaret's side of the cabin empty. The fire was already burning. She must have risen early again. Her blanket was folded neat against the wall. He sat up slowly, stretching the stiffness from his back. Through the window, he could see the first dusting of snow on the ground. Winter was here now, properly here, and they had enough wood and enough food and enough of whatever it was that made four walls into something more. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside. The air bit at his cheeks. His breath came out white. The forest stood silent around the clearing, every branch edged with frost. He walked around to the front of the cabin and stopped. Margaret stood on the porch, her hands wrapped around a cup of something steaming. She looked up at the sound of his footsteps, and the smile that crossed her face was small but real. "Morning," she said. "Morning." He climbed the new steps, his steps, the ones he'd built, and stood beside her. The valley stretched out below them, white and still. Smoke rose from the chimney behind them, curling up into the gray sky. "Going to be cold today," Margaret said. "Yeah." "Roof needs checking. That corner patch might not hold against heavy snow." "I know." She handed him the cup. He took it. The warmth seeped through his cold fingers. They stood there together, watching the snow settle on the trees, on the ground, on the world that had forgotten both of them. The next time they went to town, Doris at the store didn't say anything, just nodded at them both. Her eyes lingering on Margaret's face, the bruise finally gone now, and something that might have been relief crossing her expression. That was enough. Later, Marcus walked to the edge of the clearing. He turned and looked back at the cabin. Smoke from the chimney. Light in the window, through the glass. He could see Margaret moving around inside, doing something near the stove. The fire was burning. The door stood open a crack, letting warmth spill out onto the porch. 3 months ago, he'd stood on a different porch, watching a different door close behind him. No goodbye, no backward glance, just the click of the latch and the silence of people who'd stopped pretending to care. Now he stood in the snow, looking at a cabin that had cost $5 and weeks of work and more blisters than he could count. Inside, someone was waiting. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. Marcus walked back across the clearing. His boots crunched in the fresh snow. The cold stung his face. His hands were still wrapped around the cup Margaret had given him, still warm. He climbed the steps. He opened the door. He walked in. This story leaves something quiet behind, perhaps a heaviness in the chest, perhaps something tender, unresolved, the kind of feeling that doesn't ask to be named, just acknowledged. Many of us have known what it is to be set aside, to carry something alone for longer than we should have had to. Some of us have stood in doorways, waiting for words that never came. Some of us have learned to make ourselves small, hoping it would be enough. And perhaps you have also known what it feels like when someone finally stays. Not because they must, not because it's easy, but simply because they choose to. That quiet recognition, being seen, being needed, being enough, it doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in a cup of weak coffee, in a hand held out, in the sound of footsteps that don't walk away. Whatever this story stirred in you, it's all right to let it sit. It doesn't need to be resolved or understood. Some things are allowed to simply rest. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening.